In life, we all face moments that test us. We encounter pain, betrayal, and choices that can change everything. But it's how we rise from those moments, how we choose to move forward, that defines who we become. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey, a story of love, loss, and redemption. A story about David Wilson, a man who learned the hardest lessons life has to offer and found the strength to rebuild. It all starts with a betrayal that no one saw coming. A wife who strayed, a family torn apart, and a man left questioning everything. But what happens when you're pushed to your limits? What happens when the one person you trust breaks your heart? This is the story of how David Wilson turned his world upside down to find peace again. A journey from heartbreak to strength, and the powerful choices that led him to a new life. David Harris had always been a hard-working architect, known for his dedication to both his career and his family. His wife, Sophie, and their young daughter, Emily, were the center of his life. David prided himself on being a good husband and father, working long hours to provide a comfortable life for his family. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a quiet tension growing. Sophie seemed distant, and their once passionate relationship had settled into a routine of monotony. Sophie, on the other hand, had begun to feel the weight of years spent in a marriage that no longer satisfied her emotional needs. She was constantly busy, juggling the demands of being a mother and wife while also managing her career. Despite David's hard work, Sophie felt neglected, unloved, and unappreciated. She longed for excitement and affection, things she no longer received at home. In the office, Sophie found solace in her younger colleague, Claire. Claire was kind, attentive, and sympathetic to Sophie's feelings of loneliness. Slowly, Claire began to offer Sophie the kind of attention she had been craving. What started as innocent conversations about their personal lives soon turned into more intimate moments. Sophie was drawn to Claire's charm, and before she knew it, the two women were involved in a secret affair. They would meet in hidden corners of the city, away from prying eyes, seeking comfort in each other's company. One night, Sophie and Claire met for dinner at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town. They sat in a secluded booth, enjoying each other's company, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. It was supposed to be just another evening together, one that would bring them a sense of temporary escape from the lives they were leading. But fate had other plans. Emily, David and Sophie's young daughter, had been spending the night with a friend. When she returned home early, she decided to visit her mother at the restaurant. As she entered the restaurant, she spotted Sophie and Claire in a heated conversation, holding hands under the table. It was a moment of shock and confusion for Emily, who couldn't believe what she was seeing. Torn between her loyalty to her mother and the sense of betrayal she felt in her heart, Emily rushed home and immediately confronted her mother. Sophie's attempt to justify the situation fell flat. Emily's disappointment and pain were evident, and Sophie begged her not to tell David. But Emily, hurt and confused, couldn't keep this secret. She went straight to her father and revealed everything, hoping to make sense of the chaos that was unraveling in their family. David stood there in silence, his heart shattered. The trust he had placed in his wife for years was now completely destroyed. David didn't waste any time. He gathered his thoughts, and once Emily had gone to bed, he confronted Sophie. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a storm of emotions. "Sophie, what is this? Why didn't you come to me? Why did you betray our family?" Sophie broke down, her tears flowing as she tried to explain herself. She told him how lonely she felt, how Claire made her feel alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. She apologized repeatedly, hoping to repair the damage, but David was beyond reasoning. The truth was clear, and there was no going back. David didn't scream. He didn't shout. But his decision was final. "I want a divorce. You've broken everything. You've broken us." Sophie pleaded for another chance, but David had already made up his mind. David's resolve only strengthened as he began the process of divorce. He quickly worked with his lawyer to ensure that Sophie would have no access to their shared assets. But his revenge didn't stop there. David realized that the affair wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage, it was a deliberate attempt to ruin his life. He began looking into Claire, and what he found was even more shocking. Claire wasn't just a colleague, she was also lying about her own life. She had been using Sophie's vulnerabilities to manipulate her, and David knew he had to expose her as well. With the help of his connections, David exposed Claire's role in the affair. He made sure her lies were uncovered, and soon enough, Claire was fired from her job. Her reputation was in shambles, and the community turned its back on her. Sophie, too, felt the weight of David's revenge. He didn't just expose her infidelity, he made sure the consequences were severe. Sophie was accused of financial mismanagement and unethical behavior at her workplace, using the evidence David had gathered to make her life a living nightmare. She lost her job, her friends, and her family. Everyone turned their backs on her, and she was left alone to face the wreckage of her actions. David didn't stop there. He used his position and resources to ensure that Sophie and Claire would never be able to reclaim their lives. Sophie's legal battles began, and she was eventually convicted of financial corruption. She faced 5 years in prison, her reputation irreparably damaged. Claire, on the other hand, disappeared from public view. Her relationship with Sophie crumbled as Claire struggled to protect her own reputation, and she faded from the scene, leaving Sophie to face the fallout alone. As for David, he and Emily moved to a new city, far from the shadows of their past. David focused on his work and began to rebuild his life, drawing strength from the devastation he had endured. His career flourished, and he found success in ways he never imagined. But more than anything, he was content with the relationship he had with Emily. They grew closer with each passing day, forging a bond that was stronger than ever before. Emily, too, found a new sense of purpose. As she entered high school, she began to excel in her studies and grow into a confident young woman. David supported her every step of the way, proud of the young woman she was becoming. Their family, though scarred, was healing, and David knew that they had come out stronger for it. Sophie, after serving time in prison, found herself in a place she never thought she'd be. Alone, isolated, and with nothing left. She attempted to rebuild her life, but the scars of her past would never allow her to fully escape her mistakes. In a final act of regret, Sophie wrote a letter to Emily, apologizing for the hurt she had caused. She hoped for some kind of reconciliation, but David made it clear that their past was gone. He refused to let Sophie back into their lives, determined to protect the family he had fought so hard to rebuild. Sophie, now living in a small, dimly lit apartment, stared at the letter she had written, unsure of whether to send it. In the end, she didn't. Instead, she kept it as a reminder of the life she had lost and the mistakes that had defined her existence. David's life had taken on a new shape. With Sophie and Claire no longer part of the picture, he found peace in a new routine. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer controlled his present. He threw himself into his work, taking on larger projects that stretched his capabilities. His reputation in the industry soared, and he became a respected figure among his colleagues. But what truly mattered to him was his daughter, Emily. He found joy in the small moments, her laughter, their weekend outings, and the way she embraced her growth. She was starting college soon, and David couldn't have been prouder. She had taken all the pain and disappointment from their past and turned it into strength. He no longer saw himself as a man who had been wronged, but as a father who had fought to give his daughter a brighter future. The lessons of betrayal, the sting of loss, and the power of resilience shaped him into a man who now fully understood what it meant to love and protect those who truly mattered. Emily, though still scarred by the events, began to blossom into a remarkable young woman. Her father had been her rock, and she knew that she had to rise above the circumstances that had tried to define her. College was a fresh start, a place where she could create her own identity separate from the pain of the past. David supported her through the transition, from buying her first car to helping her adjust to dorm life. He watched her begin to thrive in a way he never expected. Emily's grades soared, and she joined several clubs where she found her passion for social justice. She was no longer the little girl who had witnessed her parents' bitter downfall, she was a confident young woman with a purpose. In time, Emily made a point to connect with people who had her back. Her friendships grew deep and meaningful, and she found herself slowly forgiving the past. She would never forget what had happened, but she had learned the importance of living in the present and moving forward. As for Sophie, the life she had once known was slipping further and further away. The prison sentence had stripped her of everything, her career, her friendships, her family. She had tried to make amends, but the door had been firmly closed. Living in a small apartment, Sophie took up odd jobs to make ends meet. But each day felt like a reminder of her mistakes. No one would hire her for a permanent position, and she struggled to find her footing in a world that seemed to have moved on without her. She tried to reach out to her family but was met with rejection at every turn. No one wanted to hear her apologies anymore. In the quiet of her apartment, she reflected on the path she had chosen. She couldn't undo the damage she'd done, and perhaps, deep down, she knew she wasn't meant to. Her regrets were heavy, but they were the only thing left that felt real. Sophie's life had become a constant reminder of the consequences of her choices. It had been years since the divorce was finalized, but one day, out of the blue, Sophie received a letter from David. It was short, to the point, and unmistakably final. "I hope you find peace in the future, Sophie. But you will never be part of my life or Emily's again. The damage has been done. Goodbye." Sophie read the letter over and over, each word like salt in a wound. She had no right to expect anything more, but the pain of being entirely cut out of their lives was more than she had anticipated. It was as if the last thread of hope had been severed. But Sophie knew she had only herself to blame. In the years that followed, David, Emily, and their lives continued to thrive. They found peace in knowing that they had weathered the storm together and that no matter what had happened in the past, they would always have each other. David occasionally thought about Sophie. He wondered if she would ever be able to turn her life around, but he knew that wasn't his concern anymore. His focus remained on his family, his work, and the future they were building. He had learned that some things couldn't be fixed, but that didn't mean life had to stop. For Emily, college was a new chapter, one where she continued to flourish and find new purpose. She had forgiven herself for the pain she had endured, and with her father's unwavering support, she realized that there was more to life than the mistakes of others. She could create her own story, independent of the broken past. And as for Sophie, there was little hope left. The remorse she carried would be her constant companion, but the world had moved on, and so had everyone who once knew her. She was left to ponder the long road to redemption, a road that seemed increasingly out of reach. Years passed, and the echoes of the past seemed to fade, but some moments continued to resonate in ways unexpected. David had built a life he could be proud of. His work had flourished, and his relationship with Emily had only deepened over time. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he found himself reflecting on what had happened. He wasn't the same man who had found out about Sophie's betrayal, nor was he the same man who had fought to rebuild his life. David had learned that even the most painful events could forge growth, but the scars were always there, in the form of subtle thoughts, lingering questions, and occasional doubts. He would think back to those years, how everything felt so raw, so out of his control. But Emily had been the light that kept him moving forward. Despite all that, David realized something important: forgiveness, or at least the understanding that people make choices and live with the consequences, was the key to true freedom. His forgiveness wasn't about Sophie, it was about him. He had freed himself from the prison of anger and resentment, realizing that he could no longer afford to live in the shadow of the past. One rainy evening, Emily came to her father, holding a letter in her hands. She had received it that morning, and it was from Sophie. Sophie had written a heartfelt letter apologizing for everything, her actions, the damage to the family, the pain she had caused, and expressed regret that she had never been able to make things right. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she hoped that David and Emily could find peace in knowing that she was truly sorry. David sat quietly as Emily handed him the letter. For a moment, he simply stared at the paper, feeling a mixture of emotions stir. It had been so long since he had even thought about Sophie. Emily, having grown into an intelligent, grounded woman, asked, "Dad, do you think we should reply?" David thought for a long time. He'd built a life, a future, and Sophie's apology, though genuine, didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the path he had chosen to walk with Emily, and it didn't change the years of hurt that had shaped them. But he knew that closure could come in many forms. "I think," David said, his voice steady, "we reply only if it brings us peace. There's no need to hold on to old pain. And there's no harm in acknowledging that the past is the past." Emily nodded, understanding her father's wisdom. It wasn't about allowing Sophie back into their lives, but about closing a chapter that had remained open for too long. As for Sophie, her life had taken a slow but steady turn. She had served her time in prison and was released. But she wasn't the same woman who had walked down that path of deceit and betrayal. Time and regret had softened the harsh edges of her past, but it also pushed her to face the consequences head-on. Sophie had spent years working on herself, seeking therapy, and trying to find a purpose outside of the shame that followed her every step. The guilt she carried was unshakable, but she had learned the hard way that healing was not something that happened overnight. She didn't expect forgiveness from David or Emily, she didn't feel she had earned it. But she started a new life in a small town, working as a counselor, helping people who were facing their own struggles with forgiveness and redemption. In a way, Sophie began to live a life where her mistakes didn't define her, but rather, her efforts to make amends did. The road was difficult, but she walked it with an awareness of what she had lost and what she was still trying to rebuild. David's life continued to evolve. He watched Emily graduate from college, her dreams unfolding in ways he had always hoped. She was now a strong, independent young woman with a future of her own, no longer burdened by the weight of the past. As they celebrated her achievements together, David couldn't help but feel proud of the woman she had become. Their bond was unbreakable, and their family was more than just the two of them. They had learned to rebuild, to move forward, and to cherish the love that had been tested and survived. Emily had taken on her father's lesson of forgiveness, not just for others, but for herself. She had learned to stop carrying the mistakes of others, and in doing so, she had truly found peace. One summer evening, as David and Emily sat on the porch, watching the sunset, David realized that, for the first time in years, he felt complete. Life had thrown unimaginable challenges his way, but through it all, he had built something beautiful, a relationship with his daughter, a future worth living, and a peace that had taken years to cultivate. Years passed, and Emily eventually settled into her own family, raising children of her own with a sense of strength and purpose that David had always hoped she would have. She remained a constant presence in her father's life, and David found joy in being a grandfather, watching his daughter pass down the lessons he had taught her. Sophie, meanwhile, had moved on as well, still quietly trying to make up for the wrongs she had done. It wasn't an easy road, but the life she had now was better than the one she had lived before, and she was at least starting to understand what it meant to live without being haunted by her past. As for David, he had found peace. No, he didn't forget what had happened, but he learned that peace was not about forgetting, it was about accepting. And so, with each passing day, he walked forward, guided by the lessons of the past but no longer shackled by them. He had created his own story, one that had moved past pain and found strength in the love and family he had rebuilt. David's journey was far from over. As the years rolled by, he continued to reflect on the twists of fate that had shaped his life. There were times when he would sit alone in his study, staring out the window, contemplating how much everything had changed. His life had unfolded in ways he couldn't have predicted, the pain, the betrayal, the healing. But as much as he had grown, he knew there was always room for more transformation. David's relationship with Emily, now a young woman with her own family, had become one of mutual respect and understanding. They had faced so much together, and it had created a bond that nothing could break. As Emily raised her children, David found himself sharing wisdom that had taken him years to acquire. He shared the lessons of resilience, forgiveness, and, most importantly, the power of moving forward. One day, Emily came to him, asking for advice on how to handle some difficult relationships in her life, how to cope with her own struggles with forgiveness and closure. As David looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw so much of himself, the same strength, the same determination. He smiled and said, "The key, Emily, is to understand that healing is a lifelong process. We may not always get the closure we want, but we can always move toward the life we want. And that starts with letting go of the things we cannot change." It was an ordinary Tuesday when David received a call. It was from Sophie. David hadn't heard from her in years, and the call took him by surprise. It wasn't to ask for forgiveness, he knew that. It wasn't to rekindle any past relationship. Sophie simply wanted to know how he was, how Emily was. David's first reaction was one of wariness. But over time, he realized that Sophie wasn't calling for any selfish reason. She had genuinely changed. She was living a quiet life now, still working with people who had their own struggles. Sophie had built a career as a counselor, working to help others understand their own mistakes and heal from them. David listened to her with a quiet patience. There was no bitterness in his voice when he spoke. He simply shared that he was doing well and that Emily had her own family now, which made him proud. Sophie was no longer the person he once knew, and in some strange way, that gave him peace. They spoke for a while, about the past and the lessons they had learned. By the end of the conversation, Sophie said one last thing: "Thank you, David. I've always regretted what I did to you and Emily. But hearing you talk, I realize how much I've changed. I just needed you to know that." David paused, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. It wasn't that he had forgiven her in the way many would think, he had simply accepted that Sophie, like him, had found a way to rebuild. "I'm glad you found peace," David said softly. "I found mine too." The conversation ended, and David felt a weight lift off his chest. He didn't need to carry that past anymore. It wasn't about reconciliation, it was about acceptance. As the years continued to pass, David's life evolved, but the lessons he learned from his own pain remained. He began to mentor young men at a local community center, teaching them the importance of integrity, resilience, and, above all, the power of moving forward. These young men, many of whom came from broken homes and difficult circumstances, looked up to David as a father figure. He spoke to them not from a place of perfection but from a place of understanding. He watched as Emily, now a successful professional in her own right, became a mother and passed on the lessons he had taught her. David knew that the cycle of pain and healing, growth and learning, would continue for generations to come. He felt a quiet pride knowing that his experiences, his own personal story, had become a source of strength for others. The life he had rebuilt was full of meaning, not because it was flawless, but because it was authentic. His relationship with Emily, his work with the young men at the community center, and the quiet moments of reflection with his old friends, it all became part of the legacy he would leave behind. And though there were still times when David thought about the past, he no longer felt bound by it. His past didn't define him anymore, the choices he made each day did. David stood at the edge of a lake one crisp autumn morning, his breath visible in the cool air. Emily stood beside him, her family gathered nearby, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. He looked out over the water, feeling the weight of his years but also the lightness of his heart. He had learned that life was about the choices you made in the present, not about the mistakes of the past. He had learned that healing wasn't linear, that forgiveness wasn't a destination but a process. And most of all, he had learned that sometimes the most painful chapters of our lives can lead us to the brightest and most beautiful moments. "Dad," Emily said, nudging him gently, "let's go. It's a beautiful day, and you've got a whole new world ahead of you." David smiled, taking one last look at the lake, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The future was uncertain, but he had learned how to navigate it with strength, courage, and, above all, an unwavering belief in the power of redemption and moving forward. And with that, David Wilson walked confidently into the future, surrounded by the love he had rebuilt and the lessons that had guided him every step of the way. David's journey shows us that, no matter how broken we may feel, there is always the potential to rebuild. No matter how deep the scars, healing is possible, and the power to start anew lies within us all. Through pain, betrayal, and countless hurdles, David found his peace. His story is a testament to the strength we each carry inside, even when we don't realize it. And as we close this chapter, we're reminded that the future is full of endless possibilities if we choose to move forward. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment of betrayal or loss that changed your life? How did you move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. If you found inspiration in David's journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on more powerful stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and remember, your story is still being written.